Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today in ADB webinar series on Southeast Asia Aviation. I'm Ida No, the project officer of Southeast Asia Aviation Landscape Study. Just for your information, the webinar series is following the recent ADB publication titled Landscape Study on Southeast Asia Aviation Industry, COVID-19 Impacts and Post-Pandemic Strategies, which is funded under ADB Regional Technical Assistance. As for the agenda today, we will start from an introduction by ADB, followed by a presentation and a panel discussion. There will be a later part of Q&A session after the panel discussion, but please feel free to raise questions anytime during the webinar in the Q&A chat box. Lastly, we would conclude this webinar by a few survey questions. So without further ado, I invite Mr. Hiroyaki Yamaguchi-san, ADB Director of Southeast Asia Transport and Communications Division, to give us an opening remarks. Hi, Hiro, the floor is yours now.
Okay, thank you very much, Idan. Good afternoon, the audience. Maybe somewhere is a good morning. ADB approved in December 2021 regional technical assistance to carry out a landscape study of the aviation industry in Southeast Asia, which covers both pre-COVID-19 developments and the impact during the pandemic. It also looks at post-pandemic recovery strategies. A pre-publication version of the landscape study was drafted and initially shared with stakeholders in September 2022 and discussed with stakeholders during the virtual seminar in October 22. In May 2023, ADB formally published the study titled Landscape Study on Southeast Asia's Aviation Industry, COVID-19 Impact and Post-Pandemic Strategy. The two webinars this week will conclude this TA by providing an update on the recovery and discuss strategies aimed at achieving a full recovery and also a green and sustainable growth in the future. Southeast Asia was one of the world's fastest growing aviation markets prior to the pandemic, with passenger traffic more than doubled in the decade prior to COVID-19. But it was one of the most impacted regions where international passenger traffic declined by over 95% in the first 2 years of the pandemic, which is April 20 to March 22. The market has recovered rapidly since April 2022, when most borders were reopened and travel restrictions were lifted in Southeast Asia. International passenger traffic is now about 80% recovered, but there are still many challenges confronting Southeast Asia's aviation sector, including manpower issues and infrastructure constraints, which has to be overcome to again achieve the rapid growth experienced prior to the pandemic. In addition, the climate change has also been affecting Southeast Asia's aviation operations in recent years, which has to be tackled properly to lead to the sustainable development of aviation sector. The second webinar, which will be held tomorrow, will look at several of these issues on the rapid recovery over the last year, while today's webinar will focus on market recovery strategies, including related recommendations from the study. This is the first time ADB's Southeast Asia transport team has carried out a study on the aviation sector. We decided to fund this study as we recognize the critical role aviation has on Southeast Asia's economy, including trade and tourism, and how it was one of the most impacted sectors by the pandemic. ADB has also been supporting the international airport expansion project at Dili in Timor-Leste, which we will briefly present at the beginning of tomorrow's webinar. In the Philippines, ADB has been supporting the construction of a new railway project connecting Manila with Clark Airport, and ADB's PPP office has been supporting the modernization of the Ninoy Aquino International Airport. With this webinar series, we hope to engage with Southeast Asia's aviation community and offer a platform to discuss pertinent issues, including infrastructure constraints and climate change impact that ADB and other development partners may have a future role in working together to resolve. We would like to thank the numerous aviation stakeholders from across Southeast Asia which have supported this study and now these two webinars by providing speakers that will be participating in our two panel discussions today and tomorrow. The panel discussions will be moderated by the co-authors of the study, Brandon Solby and Edward Clayton, which will also jointly make a brief presentation prior to each panel discussion. I'd now like to introduce two eminent consultants, Brendan and Edward. Brendan is a Singapore-based independent aviation analyst and consultant. He has been the author of several studies over the last few years, including aviation studies published by ADB in Central West Asia. Brendan has been working in aviation for more than 25 years, and as many of you are aware, he is a well-known thought leader and media commentator on Southeast Asia's aviation sector. And Edward is a partner at PwC Malaysia, Vietnam, focusing on infrastructure and transport. He's also PwC's aviation lead in Southeast Asia. Edward has been working in aviation for over 30 years. I just like to stop here and hand over the floor to Brandon and Edward. Thank you very much. Hope you can enjoy this seminar. Thank you.
Thank you, Hiro, for the introduction, and thanks everyone for participating in our webinar series on Southeast Asia aviation and for your support in this project. First of all, Edward and I were just going to give a brief, roughly 15-minute presentation looking at the study, focusing mainly on some of the recommendations from the studies, particularly those recommendations which are still relevant. The study was researched last year and initially completed towards the end of last year, and then we had a feedback process with stakeholders. So a lot of the study it looks at the impact during the pandemic, as well as the pre-COVID period, and has some assessment of the recovery, and we'll have more of an update on the recovery and how the recovery has been going so far in the first year in tomorrow's webinar. This webinar, as Hiro was mentioning, is going to focus on the recovery recommendations from the study and how airlines are adopting strategies to best recover and return to the growth that we had seen in the pre-pandemic era. I just have one quick slide on the pre-pandemic era. And this just shows the growth in the Southeast Asia in the decade prior to the pandemic. Passenger traffic more than doubled from 243 million to 510 million. Actually, it was slightly higher than 510 million in 2018. So the peak year in Southeast Asia was actually 2018. And there was a slight reduction in 2019, which was driven by the contraction of Indonesia's domestic market. Indonesia's domestic market accounts for about a fifth of overall Southeast Asia traffic. So the 22% contraction there in 2019, which was driven by a change in revenue management strategies at the airlines, and which basically resulted in most of the airlines pricing at the fare cap rather than the fare floor in Indonesia. Drove a reduction of 22% in the Indonesia domestic market, and therefore there was a slight decline in the overall Southeast Asia market. However, all the other markets in the region still continue to increase in 2019, and generally the trend was for growth in the decade prior to the pandemic, as you can see. And this growth was much faster than the global average, as the Southeast Asian market, even with the slight reduction in 2019, increased from 6% to 8% of the total market globally, and international went from 11 to 16%. So there was a much faster growth in Southeast Asia compared to the other regions of the world. And this was driven a lot by the low-cost carrier expansion in Southeast Asia during this period, and the middle-class growth in the region. So the combination of low-cost carriers growing from virtually nothing at the beginning of the century to half the market by 2019 that drove down airfares and stimulated demand. And at the same time, the middle class population grew and discretionary income levels increased significantly, leading to a kind of a perfect recipe for growth in this region. And we had, and that's what those were the two fundamental drivers of the growth that we saw in the decade prior to the pandemic. And everybody's now looking to return to that growth in the post-pandemic era. Next slide, please. And Edward's going to talk about the infrastructure, which was a key area of the study.
Yeah, thank you very much, Brendan, and good morning, everybody from London today. We looked at the recovery and growth of traffic, but we also looked at the infrastructure issues. And one of the things, I mean, Brendan just showed you very fast growth in traffic. One of the things that we saw in the mid-2010s, so 2013, 2014, 2015, was that traffic growth actually went up quite a lot faster than infrastructure capacity increased, which resulted in some tightness and congestion in Southeast Asia at the time. And as we look at the post-COVID situation, we can see the rapid bounce back in traffic now, potentially also driving that situation further. So three areas that we focused on. One is airports, so slot, passenger terminal, and runway capacity constraints. So the pandemic actually did give airports a bit of time to think and to plan how they're going to add new infrastructure, and indeed several airports have been doing that. But overall, we see that the overall challenges of slot availability, particularly at the large hub airports, and terminal capacity remain. And governments need to recognize that the pre-pandemic infrastructure issues are going to return potentially very soon and start to plan accordingly. The second is the actual airport accessibility and connectivity with multimodal transportation. We're seeing a number of significantly larger airports emerging in Southeast Asia now as a result of growth over the past decade, as we just saw. Many of those are not very well connected in terms of ground transportation and multimodal transportation. So we also would encourage governments to facilitate development of multimodal connectivity in their planning approach in order to improve the travel to and from the airports. And the third, very importantly, underinvested air traffic management system. Significant investment needed in air navigation systems, and also potentially more coordination between Southeast Asian countries. And we know that there's quite a bit of work being done thinking about that, but actually moving towards it is going to be very important over the coming few years. Thanks, Brendan. Back to you. Next slide.
Thanks, Edward. So a lot of the study looked at changes and potential changes in networks in the post-pandemic era, and had some recommendations related to how airlines and airports as well can adjust their strategies to focus on new growth areas and to fill voids from markets that maybe won't grow as much as they were in pre-COVID. Primary focus was, of course, China. China, drove most of the growth actually in the decade prior to the pandemic, and this is outlined quite specifically in the study. How important China was, not only in the overall international traffic, but also in the growth. It did account for a majority, well over 50% of the growth that I was talking about, earlier on. And it's while China is hopefully going to come back, it's now about 43% recovered as of June in terms of the China Southeast Asian market. And we all hope it will come back and fully recover, sooner rather than later. I think it's undeniable that the growth that we saw, in the pre-COVID era will unlikely return, just because, that was a kind of a one-off kind of condition in China when the economic levels and the outbound travel was growing. And so for the next growth market, for Southeast Asia, a lot of people are pointing their fingers to India, because India's, population is, now the same as China. India is very underserved in terms of the amount of flights and also in terms of the amount of outbound travelers compared to China. But inevitably, India, will grow, the outbound market particularly will grow potentially in similar proportions to China, although it will obviously take time and it's unclear, exactly where all those Indian travelers will go. But being geographically close to India and also with a lot of ethnic ties between Southeast Asia and India, Southeast Asia is obviously very well positioned for a lot of the growth that's inevitably going to come from India. So a lot of the recommendations were related to India, and we will talk about India in more detail during the panel discussion. And India has recovered very rapidly. Capacity between Southeast Asia and India is now over 90% recovered. So it's going to start growing very soon. And the question becomes is how much growth can we see, because there are constraints such as traffic light issues. And then the other recommendations related to network were regional Southeast Asia, which is a very important, economically, but also a growth market pre-COVID as well, driven again by LCCs, which have now dominate this market. Well over 60% of passengers traveling between Southeast Asian countries are carried by LCCs. And there's a lot of growth there. The study looked at some country pairs that are still very underserved or not served at all within Southeast Asia, and had some recommendations for connecting new country pairs and connecting secondary destinations as well. And then the other markets in Asia Pacific are also very important. Australia, Japan, Korea, Taiwan were growth markets pre-COVID and will continue to grow. Both outbound and inbound traffic are strong in these markets. And then long haul actually recovered quite fast in the earlier phases of the pandemic, has slowed down a bit now, but generally these are more mature markets, but still some opportunities. We see an increased number of flights, albeit on a low base, between North America and Southeast Asia, for example, and we do see some potential growth in Europe, potentially from the EU-ASEAN Open Skies Agreement, which we'll be talking about during the discussion as well. Next slide, Yadan. And this is just kind of looking a little bit more at China. I'll go over these really quickly, but again, China's 43% recovered 43% recovered right now, or 50% below 2019 levels. But the recovery is a little bit uneven depending on the country or depending on the airport you're looking at. And it's particularly secondary airports. Some of them don't have any China routes yet, again, or have a very small number. And the number of routes between Southeast Asia and China really exploded in the decade prior to the pandemic. And even in the 5 years prior, as you can see, like the number of routes from BKK, so Bangkok Suvarnabhumi, increased from 27 to 41 in the 5 years before the pandemic, and is now at 21. So still has a way to go. These slides will be made available on the ADB website, so you can look at them later. But so I won't go over the details. But the general trend is that we are recovering, but we still have a ways to go in terms of both capacity and the number of routes, particularly to some of the secondary destinations. Next slide, please. And in India, I'd highlighted the potential of India. I mean, you just look at the what India was accounting for pre-COVID, and you can see it only accounted for 4% of the visitors to Southeast Asia, compared to China at 23% and regional Southeast Asia at 37%. So the India share is obviously very small, and you can see the breakdown by country here, and also the total number of visitors between these three kind of main markets. And it's obvious that India can be a lot higher in the years to come, based on how much smaller it is compared to China at the moment. Next slide. And Edward is going to talk about changing travel patterns.
Yeah. Thanks, Brendan. Maybe just a comment on the China traffic. No need to go back to that slide, but we saw the other parts of Southeast Asia and Southeast Asia to other regions taking some time to recover after the COVID restrictions were lifted. So perhaps it's not surprising that China is also taking time to reactivate routes, and travelers are also taking time to start planning their trips outside China. So, we see this as a sort of reflection of what we saw maybe last year in the other markets. But a couple of other things that we are seeing, so changes in travel patterns and preferences. we're seeing that people are traveling differently now. Anecdotally, a lot of people are saying that they're seeing travelers spending longer in destinations. We've also seen some of our analysis showing, for example, people connecting through smaller hub airports rather than bigger ones. I mean, that may be a temporary effect simply because they need to find a flight. So one of the challenges and opportunities for Southeast Asian airlines is to actually adapt to these changing travel patterns and preferences, adjusting networks, pricing, revenue management strategies, and indeed aircraft configurations. Now, this is going to be quite dynamic over the coming year or two. So we see opportunity here for some experimentation and perhaps trying new things which hadn't been tried pre-COVID in order to find out how best to take advantage of these changes. Second thing is we're seeing consumer spending and confidence changing in different directions. Some aspects of it going up, some going down. So, sorry, we seem to have lost the slide. Thanks very much. So basically, embracing digitalization, new technologies in order to adapt to the expectations of travelers as they perhaps seek a closer direct relationship with airlines than had been the case in the past when they are using tour operators and travel agents more. And the third is air cargo activity. So we saw a very significant change in air cargo patterns during COVID, partly because freighters had to step in when passenger flights weren't there to carry cargo in the belly. But we're also seeing significant increases as a result of e-commerce and integration of manufacturing, and to be honest, the increased FDI that we're seeing in Southeast Asia. So significant opportunity here for Southeast Asian airports to focus on air cargo and relevant infrastructure, as well as for the airlines to strengthen their activities in this space. Next slide, please.
Yeah, so this is the last slide before the panel discussion, and this just looks at the regulatory environment and the role of ASEAN. And we're very fortunate to have the ASEAN Secretariat represented in today's panel discussion. And the recommendation related to ASEAN from the paper was the need for ASEAN countries to work together to pursue more multilateral air transport agreements. And we're going to go over those shortly with our speaker from ASEAN. And also to make sure policies are harmonized and air travel protocols are harmonized. Of course, that last bit is a little bit moot now, but was a big issue during the pandemic when with Southeast Asian countries really having their own policies and not really harmonizing their protocols, and this kind of slowed the recovery in the initial phases. And there was a lot of, also even a lot of local governments in some of the ASEAN countries had their own policies and protocols, which kind of set back the ability even for some domestic markets to recover. So this while this is a little bit moot now, of course it can come back again at any time, similar, crises, and it's important that we kind of learned our lesson, and hopefully that won't happen again. And ASEAN, just countries overall, can also work together better to adopt more policies and to support, facilitate a healthier aviation sector. And that can take the shape and form of a lot of different things, including less regulation, including collaborating in areas of like air traffic management, and just kind of stepping up the game, so to speak, in terms of cross-border collaboration. In order to facilitate growth. And of course, the last one is about the environment. This is extremely important in today's environment, where this has become a major issue at the global level as well as at the regional level. And Southeast Asia, I feel, is a bit behind some of the other regions in this area. So it's very important for Southeast Asian countries to work together. Again, that could be something at the ASEAN level, but also through a lot of different other platforms to advance decarbonization. SAF is the obvious kind of main one at the moment, but there's other new technologies being worked on, and other opportunities definitely for the countries to work together and for the airlines to work together to meet this environmental challenge. I'm now going to introduce the panel, and first of all, I'd like to thank ASEAN Secretariat, Cebu Pacific, and Air Asia. These are the three organizations that are participating in the panel discussion. I'd like to thank them because they were very supportive of our study, both during the research phase and during the stakeholder feedback phase last year. and that was very their role was very critical, and it's really, I'm really honored and grateful that they're participating in this discussion. Not only because they supported the study, but because they are really up on some of these issues that we're going to address. Most of these issues we discussed briefly in the presentation, but we're going to be able to get into more details with some of the active players. And also, we're also very privileged to have some of the leading airlines in today's webinar as well as tomorrow's webinar. AirAsia, represented in this webinar by Paul Carroll, the Chief Revenue and Network Officer. AirAsia is the leading airline in Southeast Asia based on number of passengers. That had 21% of the traffic that was flown by Southeast Asian carriers in 2019, which is number one, and of course has the leading regional network in Southeast Asia, having affiliates in multiple countries and having the most number of routes in both domestic and regional Southeast Asia. So it's really great to have AirAsia representation in this panel. And the number two, of course, is Lion Group, which also has multiple affiliates, and they're going to be represented in tomorrow's webinar. And then in terms of the other airlines, we have Thai Airways tomorrow and Cebu Pacific today. Cebu Pacific represented by CEO Mike Sukes. They're both, Thai Airways and Cebu Pacific are also top 10 airlines in Southeast Asia based on number of passengers carried, and the top 10 are dominate the market, as the study pointed out, with 90% market share. So it's really great to have 4 airlines, 2 today, 2 tomorrow, all leading airlines and all leading figures. And it's also great to have ASEAN Secretariat, Aung So Mo being the Senior Air Transport Officer from ASEAN, and he's been in the ASEAN Secretariat Office for several years, being a key aviation person in the Secretariat, just because it's really great to have him, because it's great to be able to discuss some of the ASEAN related issues that really only he can speak to. And so I'm going to start with, actually, Mo, just a couple questions specifically on ASEAN related issues, starting with the multilateral air transport agreements, just so he can kind of update the audience on where we are with some of these agreements. The first one, of course, was the ASEAN Open Skies Agreement, which was almost 10 years ago now. And then that followed with China, and much more recently, the European Union, which was only implemented a year or so ago. And I just was, if you can update us on the existing agreements, as well as those being negotiated, such as New Zealand, Japan, and Korea, which are kind of in the process now.
Thank you. Thank you, Bridget, and thank you all the panelists, and thank you, ADB, for inviting me. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all the audience. As Bridget mentioned, I talk a little bit about the ASEAN Open Sky. So there are 2 parts. The first one is our internal ASEAN, intra-ASEAN agreement. And the second part is our engagement with our dialogue partner. So in ASEAN, we already achieved the Open Sky agreement packet, which consists of the multilateral agreement on air services, multilateral agreement on full liberalizations of passenger air service, and multilateral agreement on the full liberalizations of air freight services, and date 3rd, 4th, and 5th. Because our current mandate for the strategic plan 2016 to 25, our current mandate is until the 5th. So in the future, probably we go more beyond the 5th freedom. So far, until 5th, we already achieved the intra-ASEAN. With our dialogue partner, as you may aware, last year, October, in Bali, we signed the ASEAN-EU Comprehensive Air Transport Agreement. The first block-to-block agreement consists of the 27 EU member states and 10 ASEAN member states, which is a combined population of more than 1 billion people. This is the first ever block-to-block agreement. And then with China, we signed the agreement with China since 2010. We are using the phased approach. I mean, we not go directly to the 5th with China for the Protocol 1, that then fought, and then Protocol 2, a few years later, we liberalized for the fifth freedom, and then Protocol 3, we add more point. Even for the fifth, which not cover all the city or the airport. From China, they offer 28 airports. From ASEAN, we offer 10 airports. So until now, we signed the agreement with EU and China, and we have the ongoing negotiation with New Zealand, the Republic of Korea, and Japan. The air services negotiation is not that easy. It takes some time. With EU, it took almost 5 years to conclude. So just difficult. But that in coming year, we will be able to sign the agreement with the New Zealand, Japan, and ROK, and we'll be happy to update you again. Thanks. Back to Brendan.
Thank you. And just one more question for Mo before we talk about more airline-related questions. Is what do you see as the future role of the ASEAN Secretariat? Obviously, you have the air transport agreements. You do a lot of work on the safety side, but what else is there? You know, what else can the Secretariat provide as we try to you know, advance our industry and facilitate growth into the next decade?
Thank you for the follow-up question. What I mentioned a moment ago is about the economic aspects. So we take care not only economic, but also the technical aspect, which include aviation safety, aviation security, and air traffic management. For the aviation safety, I would like to highlight 2 points. The first one is we are working on the mutual recognition arrangement for flight crew licensing. And the second one is ASEAN Foreign Operator Safety Assessment. This is for aviation safety. We share the rank inspection data between the authority. We have the dashboard and online platform. We can share the safety rank inspection information among member state. This is what we are doing with the safety. And for aviation security, we also have some initiative like the risk contact statement. And we also have cooperation with our dialogue partner, Japan Civil Aviation Bureau, and with the United States and with EASA, and so on and so forth. And for the air traffic management, we have the ASEAN Air Navigation Service Master Plan. This master plan, we review and revise every 3 years to be in line with the ICAO and the regional Asia Pacific seamless master plan. We also have the monitoring template. We usually monitor the progress of the harmonization of some of the initiatives like the AINDC, SWIM, FFIs, the PBN, and so on and so forth. So the member state, they report the progress twice a year. So this is what currently we are doing with the, not only on the economic, but also on the safety, security, and air traffic management. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mo. Just a note to the audience, we will take Q&A in written form only during this webinar, and we have about 45 minutes with the panelists, and you know, about halfway through we'll start reading off some of the questions from that are in the Q&A box. But in the meantime, I'm going to hand off to Edward, who's going to ask some questions related to infrastructure as we go through the topics, and then later on mix in some questions from the audience.
Thank you very much, Brendan. So in terms of infrastructure, and really, I think initially addressing this to the two airline representatives, Paul and Mike, how are you seeing airport infrastructure constraints in the region impacting your current operations and your ability to grow? Perhaps I could ask Mike to step in first.
All right, I think I've unmuted there. Can you hear me there, Edward? All right.
Yep.
Well, thank you for inviting me on. And infrastructure, actually, before, I mean, there was an interesting report just released yesterday by Aviation, one of the largest leasing firms in the world, and it just supports, I think, the challenges that you've outlined here. It's predicting that the world fleet will double by 2042. So in the next 20 years, the world fleet will double, and actually it will be the Asian region. I haven't seen the breakdown by Southeast Asia and Northern Asia, but the Asian region will lead the charge with an annual growth rate of 5.9%. And I'm pretty certain, as you've shown in your slides, that it'll be Southeast Asia that will be the bigger brunt of that in terms of air travel, based on the fact that it has got a young population, growing middle class, and all those reasons. So all these questions are not only relevant for where we've been, but they're increasingly relevant as well for the next 20 years. So where are we in terms of infrastructure constraints? And I think, I mean, I can talk very much first of all, about the Philippines. I think the major hub here in the Philippines is Manila. And of course, Manila's probably been spilling demand for a decade. And I think that is clearly a challenge for all the airlines that operate here. We're very slot constrained. It's even led us, in terms of one of our fleet strategies, is very much upgauging. So the bigger the aircraft that we can put on and use one slot, then that is what we will do. We are an LCC, so primarily we are in the short haul environment. So ideally sectors of around up to sort of 4 hours in length, or all economy is the core of our business. But we have one of our aircrafts in our fleet, which is an A330neo, which has got 459 seats on it, because that one slot on one with that aircraft is the same as 2 A321neos. And that's how we have to think about it, to maximize the availability of the infrastructure that's here. And I think, I mean, I talk about Manila because I look out the window behind me and I'm right here at Manila Airport. But I think the whole of the region, if you go to just about every metropolis in the region, there is an element of slot constraints, or it's going to be slot constrained in the years ahead, particularly given those growth profiles that I've mentioned. So it's already a major influence in the way that we run our businesses, and it's going to be increasingly so in the next 20 years. And so really, we've got to work with governments got to work with airlines and all the other partners as well, to make sure that the growth does come, because the demand will be there. The question is whether or not the demand is hindered, and therefore the economic growth is hindered because the infrastructure doesn't come on board. Now, I mean, maybe later on we'll talk about where I think the Philippines is going, because I think there's some encouraging signs in terms of the infrastructure finally being able to be addressed. But certainly infrastructure is a constraint. And if I could just go outside of Manila for a moment, we fly to about 34 destinations here in the Philippines. A number of those airfields that we go to are not strong enough or long enough for a jet. So we fly turboprops there. So again, that's an infrastructure constraint to us. Similarly, they have only daylight operating hours. So we can't fly to them during the nighttime. And so if there's a big disruption in Manila, say due to weather, we get a lot of thunderstorms at the moment. So the Manila airport can be shut for 2 hours. And then what does that mean to your turboprop that was going to fly to one of these destinations at, say, 3:30 in the afternoon? It's now delayed to a 5:30 departure. By the time, basically, it's cancelled because it can't get in and out of the airfield that it was due to go to. So these are the sort of infrastructure constraints that we have to face to. One is obviously around slots in somewhere like Manila, but also in the more regional, provincial airfields. How can we improve the infrastructure there in terms of the runway capability and nav aids, lighting, those sort of simple things as well would be a great benefit too. So big constraint.
Thank you very much, Mike. Paul, you're seeing different parts of Southeast Asia from the Philippines, so perhaps you could give us some perspectives on other areas that you're seeing constraints and how they're hampering you.
Yeah, hi Edward, hi everyone, good to be here. Thanks for having me. Look, to echo some of Mike's sentiments, not just from the Philippines perspective, which we're very much seeing the same thing in that market. But if we look at the region as a whole, nothing has really changed to pre-pandemic. Those infrastructure constraints on slots, peak hours are very much back. So I think what we're doing to mitigate that for the group at the moment is we are looking to upgauge capacity onto A330s. We're obviously investing in 321s, which we will have more deliveries next year. So it's very much a fleet game for us as well. And we're obviously looking, you know, with the coming out of COVID as well, there has been some opportunistic slot availability available, but we don't see that as long term. That's really short term, and we're looking to grasp that opportunity while it exists. But I think to echo Mike's comments as well, there's destinations we have, not just in the Philippines and Indonesia, which very much have, you know, daylight restrictions in place as well. So it's a matter of working with partners, working with regulators in those regions to really look to working together to improve that infrastructure. But in the near term, we're doing what we can to upgauge whether 330s, whether A321s, you know, on short missions within Southeast Asia, Bangkok, Jakarta, Bali on the 330s. So that will very much be the short-term play until we hope we work with our partners, work through governments to make, you know, the necessary infrastructure improvements.
Thank you very much indeed. So I think, you know, I was certainly expecting to hear about slot constraints. I hadn't quite expected to hear about lighting issues on airfields as well. So that was a slight surprise to me, and clearly not something which is too difficult to resolve, given a bit of will and a little bit of cash. So hopefully those types of things can be resolved quickly. Now, moving up into the skies in terms of air traffic management, how are you seeing that impacting your operations, and where do you see, or when do you see that might become a significant issue around Southeast Asia?
You want me to go first, or Paul, do you want to go first?
Yeah, please.
Paul, you go first this time.
All right, Paul.
Well, yeah, I think, thanks, Mike. I think, look, it's already an issue today. You know, it's not just the slot restrictions are one play, but obviously one thing we're noticing at the moment is weather patterns in the region have significantly changed. So we're seeing big increases in our block times. You know, we've had to adjust our block times to reflect that, and that's putting additional pressure on the air traffic management. Obviously, there's efficiency gains. You know, there's certain, you know, airports within the region are investing in that technology to improve it. But again, it's our operations team working with the respective regulators to improve the efficiency there. It's not going to go away. It's only going to get worse. So I think we have to hope and work hand in hand with the relevant authorities to really make sure, because it's probably come to it later in the conversation as well. It's about sustainability as well, right? You know, I think it's, you know, airlines are investing in far better fuel efficient aircraft, and I think it's working hand in hand, together as an industry, to improve, the air traffic flows within the region, because everybody benefits. The environment benefits, the airport benefits, and ultimately the airline benefits as well. So they're very real problems. They're there today. Obviously, climate change is real. We have to accept that. And I think air traffic management will have to evolve, to work together, within the industry as well.
Okay, thanks. Mike, any comments from you before I then hand over to Mo?
No, just to add on, I think, here in Manila, I think we have seen some recent improvements in sort of the last 6 to 8 months, I think, in terms of air traffic management, both here at Manila, but also in terms of looking at improvements internally within, how we fly up and down those corridors that exist north to south within the Philippine airspace. And so that's a good step forward, and I think it's a sign of the willingness of the administration to actually start looking at this. But there is a long way to go, I think. I think Manila itself, part of what I think Manila will hopefully do in the short term, or in the short to medium term, there's opportunities for Manila to be improved, I think, through privatization. I think that's now very much on the cards, that the airport here will be privatized in some point. I think the current administration is actually doing, which is government appointed, is actually doing trying to do all the right things. But I think once you put it into private hands, it will free it up overall to get the investments more rapidly, and I think that will improve the airport. But alongside that, it does need the air traffic itself to be improved. Interesting to note that the super consortium that's put in its bid to an unsolicited proposal to redevelop Manila is partnered with Gatwick. Gatwick, of course, is the most efficient sort of single runway operator in the world, pretty much. 56, I think, movements per hour. Manila is a it's 2 runways, but it's T-shaped, so they're not 2 independent runways, but it's at about 42 movements per hour at the moment. So there's clearly some upside there for Manila to do things, but we do need to recognize as well that we have got those constraints here. The weather constraints that Paul talks about are real. I mean, we are seeing thunder and lightning related events on a scale at the moment that we haven't seen in previous years. So we do have to have a bit of balance in that as well. But there's certainly upside on the air traffic control here. Not to say that they haven't actually made some improvements in recent times that they're welcome for. Now, the one thing I would like to say before you pass on to Mo, because I think this is where I think a massive amount of work could be done. If there was one thing I would love ASEAN to do now, is to focus on air traffic management within the different airspace territorial regions, so to speak. Because as I said, the Philippines is like doing some things to improve itself on going north to south, where it can control its own environment. But it really is what's happening from our environment over to somebody else's environment. How can we cut the corners? And, if we're going to talk about sustainability, we can work our socks off, which we must as an airline, to save every bit. And at some point, we'll get a long-term solution to sustainable aviation fuel. But it's the percent of savings that could be made by improving air traffic management would swamp any one of the initiatives that I've got that I can deliver probably in the next 10 to 15 years. And that's probably the reality of it. So that's where I think the ASEAN piece really could provide a great deal of focus on coordinating air traffic management across the region.
Thanks very much indeed. And when I started my career in British Airways back in the late 80s, there was a huge issue there in terms of particularly flow control between European countries, and Eurocontrol stepped in. And it became much, much better. Now, interesting, Eurocontrol is not a European Union agency. It's sort of linked to, but separate from the European Union. So with that, I'll do a segue over to Mo and say, Mo, what can ASEAN do to help to facilitate this without potentially necessarily stepping in and doing it?
Yeah. Thank you, Mike and Paul. Just to add a little bit, yes, you rightfully mentioned about the sustainable aviation fuel. Is people talking about the SAF, but the air traffic management is something we can do, because I think you are aware that the Boeing, the TBU flight from CLT to Tokyo and then Singapore and then to Bangkok, they can save fuel ban 10%. So this is what we are trying to do together with not only the regulator, but also with the aircraft manufacturer and also the airport authority. As I mentioned earlier, we have the ASEAN Air Navigation Service Master Plan, which is more or less in line with the ICAO Global and Regional Initiative. We have the meeting twice a year. We call the Air Traffic Management Strategic Planning Group. We sit down together and we share the information, and we also seek the update from the member states. So which country is doing well for instance, in the AIDC, AFDN, and then share the knowledge to some of the member states who need support in this particular area. So we're trying to harmonize our effort, and we try to improve the efficiency for across the ASEAN sky. The ultimate goal is to achieve the seamless sky. So the master plan, third edition, is targeted to be endorsed by ASEAN Transport Minister in November. Now we are in the final stage, and this document is a public document. And once adopted, we'll be happy to share with all the colleagues, and then you can have a look and you can study more detail what we are doing as a region, as a bloc. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Now, in the interest of time, I'd like to hand back to Brendan now, who's got a few questions on network, I believe.
Yeah. Before I get into the network questions, we're just going to take a couple questions from the audience to we'll kind of mix it up a little bit. There's a couple environmental questions, which we were already just kind of talking to. So this is a good segue, I think, talking about ATM specifically and how much can be saved just with ATM improvements. But the one question from one of the participants is how are airlines looking at sustainability and decarbonization, especially since aviation is a hard to abate sector? So if Mike or Paul can just talk about what airlines are doing generally in this sustainability decarbonization area, that would be great.
Let me just kick off. I mean, first of all, look, we've got to do as much as we can. And I mean, at the moment, we're about 2.5% of the global footprint. But I mean, just on the basis that I think in the early years ahead, I think other industries will be able to, it's easier for them to make inroads. So our overall percentage will grow. And also by the fact that we're a fast growing industry. As I said earlier on, we're predicted to double the number of fleet as an industry in the next 20 years. So we've seriously got to address this. I think the issue that we've got now, first of all, I mean, we're all looking at neo fleet. Cebu Pacific will be an all neo fleet by 2028. So you're looking at a 15 to 20% fuel burn reduction, right? As a result of going from a CEO type product to a neo type product. I'm talking about the Airbus platform, similar on a 737 when it puts the LEAP engine on. So I think the industry is doing that to make itself more efficient, but it's very difficult to see with all the orders that are rushing in now for everyone's trying to get capacity. These aircraft are going to be around for the next 25, 30 years. So they are going to need a hydrocarbon type fuel, a kerosene type fuel in order to power them. It's not, the switch over to, I mean, I can't see a solution in the next 20 years that's going to be flying around in a Tesla sort of 737. I mean, it's just not there. You might see much smaller aircraft than that, and maybe up to even 100-seater on smaller range. But so these aircraft are going to be around for a long while. So we've got to find an alternative to the fuel. The problem on the fuel front is that SAF is not readily available at the moment. There isn't the volume available, and the price is maybe 4 times as much as kerosene. So it's not an economic outcome. Now, over time, the production will increase and costs will come down. So it will normalize. Now, we've all got to be playing our part and working with people. I mean, we're flying around with SAF at the minute. We've got SAF on all of our delivery flights. I'm picking up an aircraft from Tianjin at the end of this month. That'll have 40% SAF fuel in it. So that's, we're doing that, and we've done some commercial flights with from Singapore because we're partnering with Shell. So you've got to be in the game to develop it. But realistically, we have to say that there's, we're not going to get SAF at big percentages across the industry for a long while to come. And that's why I think it's very important to be, doing, what as an industry can we do elsewhere where it can make big step changes? I think air traffic is one. And by the way, I think all airlines should also be doing all the low-hanging fruit, as I call it. So, we've got a lot of ground equipment, and we're in the process of electrifying pushback tugs, all of these things, buses that we use for passengers and employees, all of these things that we can do. Whilst it's a small fraction of our overall footprint, because we're an airline, we should do those anyway. But the SAF one is, for me, it's the only kind of way to see how we're going to power this fleet that we've all got now, and we're all still ordering on top of. Those engines are going to be flying around for the next 25 years. So we need a fuel alternative, and that's the reality.
Paul, do you have any thoughts on this? And also, there's a related question which Mike kind of indirectly answered already: is SAF the way forward to decarbonize the aviation industry? How can airlines do better?
I mean, Brendan, I echo what Mike has to say there. It does boil down to affordability as well. I mean, the last thing we want to do as a low-cost carrier, we're in the game to stimulate demand. We recognize we all play a part here, but unless we can get that volume, to make airfares readily affordable. The last thing we want to do is, have to take the hit to increase prices, and then economic growth slows down. So, it's a volume game, it's a numbers game. So I really echo everything Mike has said on the sustainability, on the SAF side.
Okay. I'm going to switch gears to network now, and we also have one network related question already in the Q&A. Thanks to everybody for putting in so many questions. We'll get to as many of these as possible, either live or by typing in answers. Anybody on the panel can type in answers if they would like to. I'm going to start with China, because we have a question here about China, about how our airlines, adapting to the low growth so far and the low forecasted growth, at least I guess in the short term for PRC ASEAN travel. You know, as I pointed out, only about 40% recovered. Is, you know, how you know, what are you seeing now, and what are you expecting, and how are you adapting your strategies for what you're seeing now in this key China market? I'll start.
Yeah,
with,
maybe Brendan, I'll take that one first. I think, you know, your number is you know, surprisingly low to me. I wasn't aware it was at that 43% level. I think in terms of AirAsia's recovery in the China market, you know, pre-pandemic, we probably had about 22 to 23% of our total group ASKs in that market. And we were very, very keen. You know, actually, when China opened in February, it actually took us by surprise. You know, we were expecting, and internally, we were expecting probably second half of 2023. So we were rushing to get capacity back onto that market. I think by the end of July, August, we're going to have probably about 85% of our capacity restored from Malaysia, Thailand. Actually, Thailand is fully recovered by the end of July. Our demand into Thailand, Malaysia is actually very robust. It's a bit of a different story in the Philippines. I think Mike will probably talk to that as well. There's a few geopolitical handcuffs there, which I think are short term. I think it will eventually recover. But I think in terms of AirAsia Group's recovery trajectory in the China market is significantly above the ASEAN average of 43%. You know, we're about 80% recovered. And demand is pretty much, you know, falling in line with that as well. So maybe, you know, because we were such a significant player in that market pre-COVID, we've been faster to recover. But we're actually very happy and very confident that the market is rebounding faster than what we had expected as well.
Mike, what do you see?
Yeah, well, look, I think Paul touched on the fact that the Philippines is not seeing the story that's being seen, particularly I think in Thailand, where there has, you know, almost been a full recovery. Interesting that the Chinese domestic market is way ahead of where it was in COVID. It's about 109, 110% of where it was. So people are traveling around, but they're staying within country. And I think where they are, if they are going outside, then I think they're going where it's easy to go. And I think Thailand is brilliantly set up for tourism. I mean, it is very, very easy to get in. There's plenty of options. It's a great airport, and so I think it's, if you're going to go outside, you can say, well, where's it easy to go to? And I think there have been issues. There's visa issues about coming into the Philippines, but also I think there are passport shortages. I say there's a renewals issue for passports within the country, as within China as well. A lot of people have got to renew passports, and they've got the backlog of people trying to do the renewals at the moment, and that means that there isn't the demand there. So those that are traveling are going where it's easy, and some who want to travel maybe can't because they are waiting for things like passports. I tend to believe, like Paul, that we will see this come back in totality across all of the markets. So in the Philippines, but it's maybe a 6 to 12 months before we see the Philippines fully getting back into the size of China market that it had. The only caveat to this is, you know, the Chinese economy itself maybe not be powering ahead quite in the way that it was pre-COVID. So that may have a dampening effect in terms of the expectations that we can all expect from China. But I think we should be, you know, we're at about a quarter of our capacity going into China now that we had pre-COVID. It's not it's nowhere near the size of importance as a market as it would be to say Paul, where he was saying, you know, 23% of his group ASKs were there. It was much smaller percentage for us. So, but I think we'll be getting back to the sort of capacity that we had probably in about, well, sometime in the next 6 to 12 months.
Yeah. Okay. Real quickly, I want to just touch on regional, because it's, you know, a major part of the study, and I mentioned this before. Regional international is, you know, is recovered quite well, but of secondary destinations, you know, like Luang Prabang, for example, which is in Laos, which is way down compared to pre-COVID, and there's also some point-to-point routes that haven't come back yet. And LCCs, you know, drove a lot of the growth pre-COVID in the secondary and point-to-point routes. In fact, almost all these routes are LCC routes. So I'm just curious, you know, where you know, what do you think, where is this market, and, you know, what can we do to facilitate the growth in this space? Mike, you can take it first.
Yeah, I'll pick this one up and then let Paul pitch in. I think look, I think those markets are, you're saying they're a bit slower to come back than the other markets, but actually I think the markets are still there, the demand is still there, and they'll be the same opportunities they were before. I think what you're seeing is a result of what is essentially, I think there's a big capacity overlay to this. So if you're an LCC or if you're any airline at the moment, and we're one of the few airlines got more capacity out there now than it had pre-COVID. Most airlines are still under capacity. So if you're under capacity, you will be allocating that capacity in your primary market, so to speak. And you will therefore be leaving some of those markets that you were in pre-COVID, you will not be going back into yet because you haven't been able to release the capacity or bring back all the capacity that you wanted. And that, capacity is an issue worldwide at the minute, not only reinstating it, but also maintaining your capacity flying is very, very difficult given supply chain constraints, OEMs, and goodness knows whatever else is coming at it. So I think that's probably the issue. I don't think there's any problem with those markets. I think they are there today, and they will continue to be there in the future. I mean, just to give you an example, we're growing now back into Cebu. We've reopened in Clark, but the level of competition that we've got in Cebu and Clark is considerably smaller than it was back in 2019, because respective competition has probably doesn't, well, when it's got aircraft, it chooses to put those in its more what it calls probably more primary markets.
Okay, Paul, do you have any quick thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Mike. I mean, when we kind of were starting to rebuild the network, our core focus was on the Balis, the Phukets, the Bangkoks. We were essentially following where people wanted to go first after not being able to travel for 3 years. So we were very, very focused on putting, as much capacity on those markets. And I think I touched on, China as well. It came earlier than we had expected. And, we are still in the process of reactivating our fleet. So we were essentially following the key core markets. It's not to say we won't go back onto these secondary ASEAN destinations. But one thing I will say, I think marketing plays a big role here as well. I think a lot of these destinations, we as a business, have invested in pre-pandemic, the Sihanouk fields, the Vientianes, we really need to work together with the respective tourism authorities to really push destination awareness, because you got to remember, people don't forget the Balis, they don't forget the Phukets, but I think it's all about re-educating as well. We really need to, as a business, working with the relevant authorities, marketing agencies in those countries to really spur growth back into these destinations, because people may need to be re-educated again, to really drive that demand back into these destinations.
Okay, thanks, Paul. I mean, I'm in the interest of time, I'm gonna hand it over to Edward now. He has some questions on travel patterns and cargo potentially, and he also can take some more questions from the audience if there's time. And once we come back, we can address some of the other network stuff like India if there's time. But we have about another 17 minutes.
Yeah, indeed. So, what we had seen as we did our study last year is that travel patterns did seem to be changing, that travelers were behaving differently. So again, Mike and Paul, and perhaps Mike first, what are you actually seeing in your home markets in terms of how travelers behave? And do you think that this represents a permanent shift away from behaviors pre-pandemic? Or, what are your views on those changes, assuming you're seeing them?
Well, no, I think when markets reopened last year, I mean, I think there was mad rush. Everyone wanted, people wanted to get out, but equally there was a sense of nervousness in terms of, are we out of this pandemic for good? So we had people, much shorter booking profiles. That was just the nature. But and I've got the word that I use to describe what I think is going to continue to happen over the next 6 to 12 months. I think things will start them normalizing. So, every month almost the booking curve gets a little bit longer. And I think that is going to happen. And I think the normalization will continue as well when we start to see, pre-COVID levels of capacity coming back as well, I think we'll then start to see normalization in terms of yields and load factors in the various different markets. So there are some market distortions at the moment that are very driven by capacity. But I think in terms of people's booking behavior, I think people are now starting to think about booking longer. It's probably not quite back to where it was, but it's certainly a long way removed from when, you know, we all came out of COVID just over a year ago, so to speak. So yeah, things getting longer, not quite back to where they were, but I think it will normalize in the next 6 months or so.
Sorry, Mike, when you say booking longer, do you mean longer in advance of travel or
yeah, more in
advance?
Yeah, more in advance. More in advance.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So just send the question over to Paul about any changes that you're seeing.
Yeah, I mean, again, we are starting to see what was a very compressed booking curve kind of evolve now. Like we're very active in sales campaigns at the moment to try and shift that booking curve as we restore more capacity, because the reality is, you know, with more capacity into the market, we're going to have to actively build into it. The other interesting trend we've noticed as well coming out of COVID, we've started to see the peaks becoming very, very peak, much stronger than what they were pre-COVID. So I don't know if people are, you know, taking advantage of much longer weekends. And we're also starting to see Thursday, interestingly, become a stronger day of week than what it was pre-pandemic. So that would potentially suggest that you're seeing a lot more Friday work from homes. I don't know if everyone wants to hear that, but you know, we're starting to see a shift in day of week strength across a lot of destinations, actually. You know, so we're having to adapt our RM to, you know, really get those insights onto specific markets. So some very interesting trends on the RM side, definitely coming out of COVID. So, but one thing we're happy as well is that booking curve is shifting further out, because, you know, we really understand that we have to stimulate that capacity to rebuild the demand and the network as well.
Thanks very much. So I had noticed that it was indeed easier to drive to work on Fridays than it used to be pre-pandemic. I didn't realize they were all hopping on their Asia flights, and that was driving.
Or maybe they could also not just there was a nice plug for AirAsia, but maybe Cebu Pacific as well.
Well, not so many in Kuala Lumpur where I live, but okay, thanks so much. Now on cargo, both of you are doing more cargo than you did pre-pandemic. Now, what are your plans in terms of freighters versus belly hold, and you know, is there anything else around the cargo market that you're seeing again different from before the pandemic?
Shall I? Yeah, I'll go first. Well, look, I think cargo yields are I mean, again, this is great normalization is a word I'm going to use, right? I mean, cargo yields are coming off from the peaks that they were. I think it will come back to the levels that it was, and I think I mean, all these people ordering cargo freighters. By the way, we've got 2 cargo freighters. We've got 2 ATR 72-600 freighters that we have. These were massively utilized during the pandemic, of course, because we, you know, in the Philippines was probably as badly hit as anywhere. In fact, it was the only domestic market that was smaller during the pandemic was Singapore, because it doesn't have a domestic market. But we had different restrictions between different provinces, so passenger travel was very difficult domestically. So we didn't put a jet on there, but we didn't even want to put an ATR on there. But what we did was, for cargo, we used our ATR 72-600 freighters. Now, of course, with domestic sort of fully reinstated, you know, where's that cargo capacity going? It's going into the bellies of the passenger aircraft, and I think that's very, very much how we anticipating it will continue. And you know, we have to look at, is that ATR 72-600, ATR 72-500 freighters that we've got, those 2 of them that we have, is that right for us? Because we think there's probably a niche market there, but we're not in a niche market. We're in a, you know, we're a mass transportation of passengers business, and yeah, we'll take the cargo as well, because it's an important, nice little top up. You know, pre-COVID it was about 6.5% of our overall revenue. That's not to be sneezed at. We'll continue to do it, and the cargo market will grow with e-commerce, etc., being a part of that. But I don't see for us that having specific cargo aircraft is going to be a way forward for us. I think we need to could well be a distraction if we spend too much time on it. I would rather we focused on the passenger market. And as we were talking about earlier, the passenger market is massive in this region. So let's focus on getting that bit right. If somebody else wants to go and do cargo, then so be it. But there's enough for us doing passengers, and we'll take the cargo in our bellies of our passenger aircraft. That's how we see it.
Right, thanks very much. That was a pretty clear answer. What are we seeing from Paul?
Yeah, I think from the AirAsia perspective, I think the audience will probably be aware we have a dedicated cargo unit, Teleport, who actually next month will be taking their first 321 freighter, which is a big win for them. So I think, look, whilst the majority of our cargo business is through Teleport in the passenger belly, I think the 321 freighter will open up some unique network destinations that currently are not able to serve on the scheduled operations. So yeah, we look forward to seeing how that evolves for Teleport in the coming months.
Fantastic, thanks very much. Brendan, back to you.
Yes, thanks, Edward. Just quickly on cargo, there is a question from the audience about ASEAN and standardized procedures on custom clearance. I mean, and this is an issue around the world, actually. Is this any perspective from the airlines on issues with standardized procedures, and also from, maybe I can ask Mo if he has any thoughts on whether ASEAN can improve standardization of procedures on air cargo. First, Mo.
Thank you. But for these custom, it's not directly under our jurisdictions, mine jurisdiction. So I need to check with the respective tax officer on this standardization. But we do have the standardized format for the air operating permit application. I mean, the landing permit, the overflying permit, and so on. We have the standard format, so the airline can use this form, whatever authority you deal with in the ASEAN. But back to the question for custom, I'm not quite sure. I need to check with the colleague from the custom tax. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Well, I think, and we only have about 8 minutes. So, I mean, I think I really should ask.
Could I just say, Brendan, just one
Mike.
thing I should say on the customs growth. I think one of the things is, and it is an issue. I mean, because there is growth, particularly on the e-commerce side. So you've got all these shippers sort of shipping mobile phones and goodness knows what that are there. And I think what we've got to do, right? I mean, it's not necessarily standardization across the regions, but make sure that standards are adhered to. So we've had, you know, a number of, I mean, we have to invest additional time and effort to go and make sure that the product that the forwarder is saying that he has put in his box is actually what he says it is. I mean, it's fine for us we can all carry dangerous goods as these things are classified. I mean, dangerous goods covers a number of different categories, but I'm picking on mobile phones, lithium batteries, for example. Now, we've got to make sure that the other people in this sort of supply chain, so to speak, you know, whether it's the shippers, the forwarders, whatever they may be, are actually, you know, properly adhering to what are the requirements here. And I think that is something, because it's very fast growing. E-commerce is extremely fast growing, and we've just got to make sure that all the people playing in this game actually adhere to the things correctly. At the moment, we at Cebu Pacific, and I'm sure the same in AirAsia, having to invest a lot of time because our counterparts aren't necessarily approaching this with the diligence that they have. Now, we've actually been educating them, so it's got an awful lot better. But we've actually lost some business because we've had to do this. Because fundamentally, we have to make sure that the standards are adhered to. If a partner's not doing it, then we need to make sure we put additional things in by ourselves. Now, that's not sustainable in the long term. We need the whole industry to get better. And I don't think it's so much the airlines. I think it's the forwarders, etc., that need to improve. I don't know if Paul's seeing some of the same with their teleport arrangements or whatever.
Yeah, I would need to check that. Not to my knowledge, to be honest. Not to my knowledge.
Okay. Well, thanks, Mike, for bringing that up. That, I mean, this area is quite important, especially if we're going to increased focus on cargo and ASEAN. Just one quick point is really, if you look at ASEAN carriers, they really are underperforming in cargo in terms of percentage of revenue, percentage of freighter fleet globally. So there is an opportunity there, but there's also a lot of challenges and regulatory issues that have to be addressed. I was just, we probably only have time for one more question, but I really wanted to bring up India just because it's something that everybody's really focusing on so much these days. And just quickly wanted to ask Paul, like, whether he is, AirAsia is also quite keen on India growth, Southeast Asia, India, and whether, the expectation for India, to emerge as the kind of main growth and main source market going forward into a lot of your countries. Is this realistic, or are there a lot of, issues, including the traffic right issues, that make it perhaps a little bit difficult to actually?
Look, yeah, I mean, look, our biggest inhibitor to growth in the India market for our units in Malaysia, Thailand, is obviously the traffic right restrictions. We're maxed out, and it's not a matter of just frequency. It's restricted by seats. We would love to be able to add capacity both sides into India from Malaysia, Thailand, but we are maxed out on what we can do today. The India market for Thai AirAsia, Malaysia AirAsia, critical, very, very important market. Was probably our fastest international portfolio to recover post-pandemic. So we're back to full capacity restoration in the India market, but we're obviously, we're inhibited by the traffic rights. So look, we would welcome any government-to-government talks in terms of, easing those restrictions, and I think that's something that I think it will come to the table eventually, but it's obviously something that is outside of our control today. Just to add to that, to mitigate that and to grow into the India market, we're obviously, we are investing in secondary cities as well. We have a big network into India, 15 destinations. Very, very important markets, southern India, Kochi, Trichy, from Trichy, 3 flights a day from KL, Kochi double daily. So we're doing what we can to invest in that market. And it's not just the point-to-point market. A lot of that traffic is going onwards as well. So about 50% of our point of sale India demand flies via the hub onwards. So, we're continuously looking to invest in that market. And until we get some resolution to the traffic rights restrictions, we will continue to look to invest in those secondary, tertiary cities in India as well. We've done it in the past, and we will continue to evaluate those cities, in the future as well, for both the Malaysian operation and the Thai operation. And we're also looking at the Indonesia market to southern India as well. That's something we're looking to go live with in the 4th quarter of this year. So a big market for us. We're very, kind of cautious of having all our eggs in one basket. We don't want to completely rely on China. So, we like to have a diversified network, and it's a big destination for AirAsia Group.
Yeah, and that matches kind of, the diversification issue. But just so some of the participants understand, in India, generally traffic rights are related to the metros, the 6 metro cities where 100% of the capacity came back already several months ago, and now a lot of airlines can't add to those metros. Secondary cities are generally open, so Southeast Asian carriers can add to those secondary cities, but and there is potential in those secondary cities, especially when you look at some of the connecting and fly-through markets. But the problem is a lot of the population growth is in those metros. And just over to Mo about, a lot of airlines in Southeast Asia are asking for, ASEAN to try to negotiate something with India to kind of resolve this logjam. Is there any opportunity there, Mo, or is this too challenging right now from the India side perspective to take place?
Yes, we have the engagement with the ASEAN airline. We have the ASEAN airline meeting twice a year, and around 25 to 27 airlines participate in the meeting, and we hear the voice from the airline. So airline keep pushing the government's authority to negotiate with India. Back in 2010, we sent the draft agreement, the draft text of the agreement to India since 2010. And then we tried to communicate by all means, by diplomatic channel, directly to the agency. And unfortunately, I think the India side hasn't shown much interest to negotiate with ASEAN as a bloc. We understand each and every member state, they already have the bilateral agreement, but what we are going to do is for multilateral agreement to be meaningful, the traffic right should be over and above what the existing bilateral agreement. So we are going to do that, but we are trying by all means, and then now India side show very little interest, and Malaysia is the lead country for negotiation with India, and we also closely coordinating with the Malaysia Ministry of Transport to try to contact to the Indian counterpart to come to the negotiation table. And one of the things is a few years ago, an Indian side once said, according to the policy, they are not in the position to negotiate with open sky agreement with any bloc within 5,000 kilometer radius from the capital Delhi. This is one of the things one of the reasons from the Indian side, they are not ready to negotiate with any bloc for open sky within 5,000 kilometer radius. So anyway, we will keep trying to pursue India to come to the table and to sit down together.
Yeah, this is definitely a major issue.
Yeah,
going forward, and there's a lot of issues with individual countries in India trying to get a significant breakthrough in traffic rights. Sometimes there are incremental increases that are used up almost instantaneously, and to try to get to a higher levels, particularly given that we see all this demand coming from India. Mike, do you have any thoughts on India? Just like in 30 seconds, whether you're interested in India or.
Well, look, I wouldn't rule it out, but I mean, is it the priority that it is for Paul? I mean, look, if you just look at the geography of it, I mean, you've almost got to go twice as far to get to the Philippines, and you've got to fly over some, Thailand. I mean, it's if we're in a pure LCC, I mean, generally we should be in short haul markets. I mean, and there's plenty of opportunities closer to home that is probably more priority than India. We need to see how that market grows. I think it will be of interest. Interesting enough, I mean, both India and now the Philippines, they're the BPO capitals of the world almost. So there is almost as well as just sort of a tourism connection from Indians wanting to come to the Philippines. I think there is a sort of a business aspect to it. The tourism one, if you've got to fly over some nice places to cut, in Thailand, for example, before you get to the Philippines. Why would you fly an extra three hours or so, 3.5? I mean, in order to get there and take the extra cost. So I think that's one of the things that we need to look to. But of course, if the demand is that strong, then we need to be in it. But I can see why it's a much bigger priority for Paul, given the geography of it, than it would be for us.
Yeah, I mean, and interestingly, we have seen a phenomenal growth between Vietnam and India, and other countries like Cambodia and Brunei are very keen to also enter into India. So I think we will see more country pairs, but it might be more limited than the hub traffic, because the hubs have a lot of benefit in doing the fly-through traffic. I'm going to have to hand it back to Yidan now, because we only have a few minutes left before our 3:30 closing. Just like to thank all the speakers and all the participants, and Yidan we're going to quickly do a brief survey with everyone, and then she'll have some concluding remarks.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Brandon and Edward, for the presentation earlier. And also thanks to all the distinguished panelists for such insightful discussion. Lastly, thanks to all the participants. Thanks for all the questions that you raised. I'm very sorry that due to the time constraint, we may not be able to have covered them all fully, but hopefully this webinar has been helpful in providing such a communication platform. So last but not the least, I would like to invite all the audience, including the panelists, to fill in a few survey questions. As you can see on the screen, there are 3 questions, basically. First of all, we would like to hear your view on the most important aviation factor for Southeast Asian countries in aviation, to focus on whether it's infrastructure in airports or in air navigation, or it's more on the air rising, or it's air cargo, as we discussed, or the environmental sustainability improvement issue that we have slightly touched, but it becomes more and more popular nowadays. The second question is about your view on our study published early. Hopefully, you have read that. Last question is on your overall experience of the webinar. Take your time. I will be opening this polling survey for another minute or two. Just take your time to fill in whatever you feel suitable.
So I'm not sure about everybody else, but I'm not seeing the survey on the screen.
I am fine. So it might just be your screen.
Yeah, I can see, a lot of the people are filling in the survey and the result keep changing. So I'll open it for another maybe 1 minute until it's more or less stabilized, the result.
Yeah, in the meantime, I mean, we had one question in the audience that's kind of interesting, pointing out that Dubai, Tel Aviv bursted onto the scenes for other obvious reasons. Is there any Southeast Asian routes that burst into the scenes during this period, like a new Southeast Asian routes? Paul, do you have any thoughts? You're the network guy, about new routes that kind of came out of nowhere during this, during the post-pandemic period.
Oh.
Sorry to put you on the spot, but we have a minute as we're tallying the results.
Too many to mention. I don't know where.
I mean, like.
Yeah. I mean, look. One thing we've noticed is I don't know if the Russian traffic in the region is actually quite strong. Now, I think that's a function of Europe probably being closed. So our Nha Trang is actually quite a strong destination at the moment. We see a lot more Russians traveling intra-ASEAN at the moment on AirAsia. So that's quite an interesting trend we've seen. So Nha Trang has really been very strong for us since we've come out of this hibernation post-COVID.
Okay, thanks. I'm not going to. Mike, do you have any quick one? I mean, just in 1 minute, where is anything? No.
No.
You're back. You're back to everything, right? Yeah.
Well, we haven't put. I don't think we've got. No, we're pretty much. Yeah, we're back to where we were before, and I think that's what we're looking to do, and adding frequencies to the destinations that we were before. I mean, that would be. There's some places that we're flying to more than we did pre-pandemic, which is a sign of increased demand on those markets. So that could be Thailand, it could be Dubai. I mean, there's a few places up there, and with more capacity coming back, then there'll be more destinations like that.
Okay. The results are ready now. So Yodan, if you want to go through the results.
Yeah,
quickly.
sure. Let me just briefly go through the results. For the first question, the most critical factor, airport infrastructure, as we have been talking quite a lot, is leading all these options. And for question 2 and 3, it's very glad to see that most of the audience found this study as well as this webinar very helpful, at least satisfactory to them. So thank you very much again for your time and for your active participation in this webinar. Just a reminder that we will continue our discussion tomorrow on this rapid recovery over the last year in Southeast Asia aviation. So we look forward to having you again tomorrow, 2 p.m. Manila time, or the same time as today. So hope to see you again and have a good remaining of the day. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.